Something appeared where the old story seemed closed. Why did Able Archer, 83, the NATO exercise that looked like nuclear war, change what people thought was buried there? Early November 1983, NATO forces across Europe begin a rehearsal. Not a war, a drill, a test of command and control, run every year, on schedule, with clear intentions. But on the night of November 8th, or the 9th, a cable moves through KGB channels in Western Europe. A flash message, urgent. It warns that United States forces on the continent have gone on alert, and it asks a question that no one in Moscow should have needed to ask. Was this the countdown to a surprise nuclear strike? The alert was not real. The cable was wrong, but the fear behind it was not. Hold that question. Because for years, the full shape of what happened during those days stayed inside classified files. And when it came out, it forced people who study the Cold War to reconsider how close the two sides came to a mistake that could not be undone. To understand why a routine exercise could be misread as the beginning of the end, you have to understand the autumn that came before it. 1983 was not a calm year. The tension between Washington and Moscow had been climbing for months. The relationship between the two nuclear powers had turned brittle. Suspicion had replaced routine. Then came the shootdown of Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian airliner gone from the sky. The incident hardened positions on both sides. It confirmed, for many in Washington, a Soviet system that acted first and explained later. And it confirmed, for many in Moscow, that the world was watching them, waiting, judging. Fear feeds on fear. At the same time, NATO was preparing to deploy a new generation of intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe. These were weapons that could reach Soviet targets faster than anything before them. From Moscow's point of view, the geography of threat was changing. The warning time was shrinking. A strike could arrive with almost no notice. So consider the mindset inside the Soviet leadership as autumn deepened. They believed a surprise attack was possible. They believed the United States might strike first. They were watching Western Europe closely, looking for the signs. And a small note on that word: signs. Because an intelligence service that is told to look for the beginning of a nuclear war will eventually find something that looks like it. That is the danger of expecting an attack. You start to read ordinary events as warnings. Now place the exercise into that world. Able Archer, 83. An annual planned command and control exercise. Nothing about its existence was secret, in the sense of being hidden from history. It happened every year. It was a way for NATO to practice the procedures that would be used in a crisis. The messages, the coordination, the chain of decisions. But according to the CIA's own account, the 1983 version was not identical to the ones before it. That year's exercise included a practice drill. A drill that took NATO forces through a full-scale simulated release of nuclear weapons. Simulated. A rehearsal, not an order. But rehearsals leave traces, communications change, patterns shift. The procedures used to prepare for a real nuclear release look, from the outside, very much like the real thing. And on the other side of the line, someone was watching for exactly that. Here is the problem at the center of this story. The people running the exercise knew it was an exercise. The people watching it did not know for certain. They saw activity. They saw the shape of a nuclear alert taking form. And they had spent months being told to expect a surprise attack. So when the flash cable moved through KGB residencies in Western Europe, It was not asking an idle question. It was asking the residencies to confirm something. It reported incorrectly that United States forces in Europe had gone on alert, and it asked whether that alert might be connected to a countdown. A countdown to a surprise nuclear attack. Read that carefully. The cable did not simply ask for information. It framed the question around the worst possible answer. It assumed the shape of the threat and asked the field to fill in the rest. That is how misperception hardens into decision. You start from fear, and you gather evidence to match it. And the Soviet reaction did not stop at a cable. According to the National Security Archive's summary of a document known as the Perroots Addendum, the Soviet response went further than words. Soviet air forces were placed on heightened readiness. So was the group of Soviet forces in Germany. Fighter bombers were placed at 30-minute alert. 30 minutes. That is the window between a normal night and aircraft ready to move. And there was more, though this piece stayed hidden the longest. The same posting states that signals intelligence showed the Soviet 4th Air Army alert included preparations for immediate use of nuclear weapons. Preparations for immediate use. In response to what NATO believed was only a rehearsal. Think about the gap between those two realities. On one side, officers running through a script, following a schedule, expecting nothing. On the other side, air forces moving to readiness, aircraft on alert, and preparations tied to nuclear weapons. Two militaries, standing across the same line, seeing two entirely different nights. One believed it was practicing. The other believed it might be watching the opening of a war, and between them, almost no one who could see both pictures at once. That is what makes this near miss different from the ones people already knew. There was no single dramatic order, no finger on a button in a bunker, just an exercise on one side and a misreading on the other, drawing closer without either fully understanding the other's fear. The question that would matter most had not yet been asked. Someone on the NATO side would soon notice the unusual activity in the East. What that person chose to do next would decide how this story ended, and whether anyone would recognize, in the moment, how close they had come. That person was an intelligence officer named Perroots, and the choice in front of him was not obvious. He was watching the Eastern Bloc. He saw the activity. Air forces on heightened readiness, aircraft at alert. The kind of movement that, in a different context, would demand a response. Because that is the instinct built into a standoff like this one. When the other side raises its readiness, you raise yours. You match the threat. You do not let them gain an advantage while you stand still. It is the logic that has governed military postures for as long as there have been militaries. And it is exactly the logic that, on this night, could have turned a misunderstanding into a catastrophe. Follow the chain if he had followed the instinct. NATO sees Soviet forces go to alert. NATO raises its own readiness in response. Soviet intelligence, already primed to expect a surprise attack, sees NATO's readiness climb. That confirms the fear. The fear justifies more readiness, and each step looks to the other side like proof that the attack is coming. That is how two forces that both want to avoid war can walk into one anyway. Not through a decision to fight, through a series of reactions, each one reasonable on its own. Perroots did not do that. He informed General Billy Minter of the unusual Eastern Bloc activity. He reported what he was seeing, but his recommendation was to wait, to hold, to let the exercise run its course and see whether the activity was caused by Able Archer itself. rather than raising NATO readiness in response. Sit with that for a moment. He was looking at Soviet aircraft on alert. He did not have the full picture the Soviets had. He could not see inside their command channels. He could not know how close their fear had brought them. And still, he chose not to escalate. He chose to break the chain before it could tighten. It is worth being precise about why that was difficult. The safe institutional choice in almost every case is to match the other side. If you raise readiness and nothing happens, no one blames you. You were being careful. But if you hold, and the threat turns out to be real, the failure is yours alone. The pressure runs entirely in one direction, toward escalation. Perroots pushed against that pressure. He waited, and the exercise ended. The activity, whatever it had truly meant, subsided with it. The two sides stepped back from a line neither had fully understood they were standing on. But here the story does not simply close with relief. Because the most unsettling part is how long it took anyone to grasp what had happened. The men running Able Archer finished their exercise and moved on. The measure of how close things had come did not arrive in the moment. It arrived later, in reports, in files, in assessments written after the fact by people trying to reconstruct a night that had already passed. Which raises a question that runs underneath this entire episode. If the danger was real, why did it take Reconstruction to see it? The answer is that no one on the NATO side experienced it as a crisis at the time. To them, it was a successful exercise. The alarm existed only on the other side of the line, in channels they could not read. The near miss was invisible to half the people who were part of it. And that invisibility is the thread to hold as this moves toward its final turn. Because two things had to happen for the truth to surface. Reporting had to reach Washington from inside the Soviet system, and someone at the top had to be willing to ask an uncomfortable question about what that reporting meant. There was a source, a Soviet intelligence officer whose name would later become known, Oleg Gordievsky. His reporting and other intelligence would eventually reach Washington and change how the events of that autumn were understood. Not as a routine exercise that passed without incident, but as something closer to an edge than anyone had realized. And when that picture assembled itself at the highest level, it produced a reaction that was, in its own way, remarkable. The reaction did not come from an analyst. It came from the president. That is where this story turns next, toward a question asked at the very top. A question about whether the other side had truly believed the unthinkable, and whether the machinery built to prevent war had, for a few days in November, come close to starting one. The question would come from Reagan himself, but before it could, the reporting had to travel. And that journey is worth understanding, because intelligence does not arrive as a finished truth. It arrives in pieces. A cable here, a source there, an assessment written by someone who was not in the room. The picture of Able Archer 83 assembled slowly, from fragments that had to be gathered, weighed, and fitted together. And one of those fragments came from a man inside the system that had reacted. Oleg Gordievsky, a Soviet intelligence officer. Someone positioned to see how his own side had read the events of that November. Not from the outside guessing, from the inside, watching the fear take shape in the channels around him. That kind of reporting is rare. Most of the time, each side can only measure the other by what it does. The movement of aircraft, the change in a communications pattern, the outward signs. But Gordievsky's reporting offered something different. It offered a glimpse of what the Soviets believed. Not what they did, but why they did it. And what it suggested was unsettling. That the Soviet reaction to Able Archer had not been theater, had not been a bluff or a routine precaution. That the fear behind that flash cable and behind the aircraft at 30-minute alert had been genuine. They had truly considered the possibility that the rehearsal was the real thing. Now place that alongside what had already been true. NATO had run its exercise believing it meant nothing. The Soviets had watched it believing it might mean everything. And the only reason those two realities did not collide was a decision to wait. A single officer choosing not to match an alert he did not understand. When you lay the pieces side by side, the shape of the near miss becomes clearer than it ever was in the moment. But clarity after the fact carries its own weight, because it means the danger was real, and no one had felt it in real time. And that is what makes the later assessments so striking. Years afterward, a review would look back at those days and reach a conclusion that is hard to read casually. That United States and Soviet nuclear relations may have been placed, inadvertently, on a hair trigger. Inadvertently. No one chose it. No one decided to bring the two arsenals that close to the edge. It happened through misperception, through a rehearsal on one side and a misreading on the other, through fear that fed on fear until the machinery meant to prevent war nearly served the opposite purpose. And the same review would single out the decision not to escalate, the choice to wait, to break the chain rather than tighten it. It commended that restraint as the thing that kept the night from becoming something else. Think about what that means. The system did not save itself through its procedures. It was saved in part by one person choosing not to follow the instinct those procedures were built around. That is a thin margin, thinner than anyone running the exercise ever knew. And it raises the hardest question this episode holds. How many times did something like this happen without anyone assembling the pieces afterward? Because Able Archer was only understood because the fragments arrived, because a source reported, because an analyst reconstructed, because someone at the top was willing to ask what it all meant. Remove any one of those, and the night passes into history as nothing. A successful exercise, a quiet November, no file to declassify because no one ever wrote it down as a danger. That is the thread that runs beneath all of it. The near miss that half the participants never noticed. The crisis that existed only in channels one side could not read. And the growing suspicion that the Cold War held more of these moments than anyone has counted. Which brings the story to its final turn. To the question asked at the very top by a president who read the reporting and wondered whether the other side had truly believed the United States might attack. Because that is what the intelligence suggested to him. Not a bluff, not posturing for advantage. A real belief held inside the Soviet leadership that an American first strike was possible. And when that reporting reached Washington, the reaction at the top was not procedural. It was human. President Reagan asked whether Soviet leaders really believed the United States might attack them. He called it something to think about. Sit with the plainness of that. The man who commanded the largest nuclear arsenal on one side of the standoff, reading intelligence about the fear on the other side, and arriving not at a plan, but at a pause. Something to think about. Because until that reporting arrived, the fear had been invisible from where he stood. The United States had run its exercise believing it was understood for what it was. A rehearsal, a schedule, a test of procedures. The idea that Moscow might have watched it and seen the opening of a war had not been part of the picture. And that gap between what one side intended and what the other perceived is the entire weight of this story. Two governments, each holding weapons that could end the other, each convinced it understood the rules of the standoff, and each, in November of 1983, reading the same days in completely different ways. One side rehearsing, the other preparing, and almost no one able to see both at once. The question Reagan asked was the right one, but notice when it came. After the exercise had ended, after the aircraft had stood down, after the danger, whatever its true size, had already passed. The understanding arrived too late to matter in the moment. It could only shape what came next, and perhaps it did. The reporting from Gordievsky and others may have changed how Washington thought about the fear on the other side. It may have softened the edges of a standoff that had grown dangerously brittle. But that is a different story, and a slower one. What remains from these few days in November is harder and simpler. A rehearsal that looked to Moscow like the real thing. A flash cable asking whether the countdown had begun. Aircraft at 30-minute alert, with preparations tied to nuclear weapons, and a single decision to wait rather than to match, that may have been the only thing standing between an exercise and a catastrophe. None of it was recognized as a crisis while it happened. The alarm lived entirely on one side of the line. The restraint lived entirely on the other, and the truth had to be assembled afterward, from fragments, by people who had not been in the room. That is what leaves the questions open. How much did either side really understand about the other's fear in that November? The evidence suggests the answer is far less than either believed. Would a different response to the Soviet alerts have changed the outcome? We know only what the restraint produced. We can never test what the alternative would have cost. The chain was broken before it could tighten. What it would have led to remains a thing that never happened. And the last question is the one that does not close. How many Cold War near misses stayed invisible because no one recognized them in real time? Able Archer was understood only because the pieces arrived. A source who reported. An analyst who reconstructed. A president willing to ask what it meant. Remove any one of those, and the night becomes nothing. A quiet exercise. An ordinary November. No file because no one ever wrote it down as a danger, which means the record we have is not a record of the near misses. It is a record of the ones that were noticed. And somewhere in the decades of that standoff, there may be others. Nights that passed as routine on one side, and as the edge of war on the other, with no source to report them, no analyst to assemble them, and no question, asked at the top, to make anyone think about them at all. That is the part that stays classified, not by any government, but by history itself. Because you cannot declassify a danger that no one ever recognized. And in November of 1983, the danger was very nearly one of those.